Welcome to our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of John. Today we're in John chapter 18. We're going to start reading at verse 28. Now, on Thursday night, Jesus had been arrested while in the garden. And there had been overnight 2 trials or 2 hearings. First before Annas, who was father-in-law to Caiaphas, the high priest that year, and then before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. And then they send Jesus in the early morning to the Roman governor, Pilate. And that's where we're going to start reading at verse 28, when they take him to Pilate. So the Jewish leaders, and this is the Sanhedrin led by Caiaphas, the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked them, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" So they're bringing Jesus before Pilate, asking for Roman punishment. Now remember, the Sanhedrin is the Jewish ruling council. They are allowed to govern local affairs and to handle many matters of discipline and punishment. But what they are not allowed to do is execute a criminal. The Romans reserve that to themselves. So if they want to get Jesus executed, which they do, they have to take him before the Romans, that is before Pilate. That's why they've gone to him early in the morning asking for what they call Roman justice. They're just seeking to have Jesus killed, and they know the Romans are the ones who have to do that. So they come before Pilate. Pilate realizes they're bringing accusations, so he asks them, "What charges do you make against this man? What are you accusing this fellow of?" Now notice it says they would not go into the governor's palace because that would make them ceremonially unclean to enter a Gentile's home. And they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Now this indicates that the Passover is that evening, on Friday evening. But we know from the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that Jesus and his disciples had eaten the Passover on Thursday evening before they went to the garden. So what's going on here? When exactly was the Passover? There's been a lot of speculation about this, and I think we already mentioned this in our Bible study. But we know for a fact the priests were not going to eat the Passover until Friday night. That's why they didn't want to become ritually unclean by entering a Gentile's home, the home of the Roman governor. I suspect that the Passover meal is set for that Friday night, which is what the priests are waiting for. And I suspect that Jesus had the Passover meal with his disciples a night early. That is one of the possibilities, that the disciples of Jesus and Jesus were celebrating the Passover a night early, earlier than it normally would have been. Jesus wanted to have it with them and emphasize its meaning, that it was prophetic of how he would become the Passover lamb and give his life for them. That's why he took the bread and said, "This is my body given for you." That's why he took the cup and said, "This is my blood shed for you." He used the Passover meal that they celebrated a night early to let his disciples understand that he was the Passover lamb. But the rest of the Jewish population, and certainly the priests, were planning on celebrating Passover on Friday night. But anyway, they brought Jesus before Pilate, and he says, "What charges do you bring against this man?" Notice what they say in verse 30. "If he were not a criminal," they say, "we would not have handed him over to you." It's kind of arrogant on their part. Listen, we only bring criminals to you, so just go ahead and give justice and don't worry about the charges. So Pilate says, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." I think Pilate realized that this is just a personal vendetta for them, and he's really not interested in the case. So he says, "Just judge him by your own law," which they are allowed to do. But of course they want capital punishment. So they say, "But we don't have the right to execute anyone," they say, or they object. Now all this took place to fulfill what Jesus said about the kind of death he was going to die. So they show their hand here. They really just want him executed. And that's why they brought him to Pilate. So Pilate goes back inside the palace. He summons Jesus and he asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now why did they ask that? Or why did Pilate ask that? Are you the king of the Jews? It's clear that the charge they brought against Jesus was that he was inciting a revolt against Rome. Now listen, they knew Pilate would not be interested at all in the the Messiah or the teachings of Jesus that they objected to. But Pilate would be interested if they said, this guy claims to be a king. He's hoping to start a rebellion. That would draw Rome's interest. And so they obviously accused Jesus of attempting a rebellion against Rome, of setting himself up as king, which they hope will lead Pilate to have him executed as a rebel. It's a false charge, of course, and I think Pilate realizes that, but that's the accusation they're making, trying to get that capital punishment imposed by Pilate. And that's why Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? Now, in tomorrow's session, we're going to see how Jesus answers this charge and what Pilate decides to do. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of John.